Shabbat Shalom. And that's it. Nothing else. We're back to our regular parasha of Shemini, having one of the most dramatic narratives in the entire book of Vayikra. Blink and you miss it, and yet it is so profound. The story, if you have not been keeping up so far, you could always do so. It's only you're maybe only a few chapters behind. The story so far is that we have left Egypt. You all, I'm sure, are on that page. We have arrived at Mount Sinai, we have received Torah, and we have built the Mishkan. That was the great capstone of the book of Shemot, of Exodus. And now here in Vayikra, we have not only assembled the Mishkan, we have learned what to do in it, and finally now, 10 chapters in, we're going to start using it. You know, instructions first, read the manual, and then start doing things. And unfortunately, it all goes wrong on day number 1. Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, who are going to be serving as the regular Kohanim, as he is the Kohen Gadol, the high Kohen, they decide that the rule book, well, that's unclear what they decided actually, because they show up and they offer an Eish Zara, a foreign fire, an alien fire, not from, History Channel fame of aliens, but a fire that seems not to have been in God's instruction book. God did not ask for this fire, and as they offer it on their incense coming towards the Mishkan, fire comes out and consumes them. They are dead, like that, blink of an eye. And then we get back into some of the other details that the book of Leviticus wants us to know. You can imagine the commentaries erupt into discussion over how these 2 men were struck down. Remember, every time we talk about the children of Aaron, we're not talking about 5-year-olds. These are grown adult men. Well, the commentaries begin. One side, and trust me, there's more than 2, but one side begins saying, well, you have to understand, these were 2 arrogant young men. These were 2 people that looked at Moses and Aaron, who were standing before them, as obstacles. These were 2 young people who said, when are these 2 old guys going to die so that we can take over, so that we can be in charge? And at the same time that they were wondering when they would get out of the way and let them strut their stuff as the rightful leaders of the Jewish people, they also were having their look over the nation, trying to pick who it would be that they would marry in order to properly complement their status. As they would now be the pick of the entire nation, well, they should have their choice of whomever they wished to marry. Needless to say, God was not happy with their arrogance, and they were removed from the slate. Aaron had others that could take their place, something they should have considered. And other commentaries say something completely different. They say, no, this was not a case of arrogance, this was not a case of thinking they could do it better. This was a case of just youngish people being stupid. Not arrogant, but stupid, and those are 2 different attitudes. Perhaps they were drunk. After all, immediately after this debacle comes the commandment that one should not be consuming wine or hard liquor before officiating at the Mishkan. Coincidence? I think not, say the commentaries. This is an implicit criticism of Nadav and Avihu, who obviously were stumbling around the Mishkan, offering up something that was not according to the rules because they were drunk. And therefore, don't be an idiot, don't be a fool, but we shouldn't see anything as a deeper character flaw in their behavior. Still, of course, when you're dealing with the actual altar of God, there's no margin of error. It's much like, if you are driving a car. Being a young idiot who gets drunk doesn't excuse what happens once you begin driving down that road. And then there were other commentaries that say they did nothing wrong at all. They were not arrogant. They were not drunk on power. nor on wine. They were instead two young people who were dedicated to God, passionate for what their role would be, serving as Kohanim, and what they brought before God was the purity of their spirit. And God looked at that pure, passionate devotion and said, these two young people, there's no reason why they should spend another minute on this world, which can have all of its problems. And they were taken up as if kissed by the fire. They were given the fast pass to cut through the line and head on into Olam Haba, into the world to come. Which commentary is right? Are these two young people arrogant and power hungry? Are these two young people drunk and foolish? Are these two young people passionate and devoted? We don't know. We don't know. It's why the commentaries are written. If we knew, there wouldn't need to be a commentary. It would just be obvious. When God says, don't eat pork, we understand what that means. Don't eat pork. But here, the unique character flaw or blessing that led to this moment, well, we're not 100% sure what it is. Well, if we're not sure, then what are the commentaries doing? Where did they get off trying to tell us what happened? Are they inventing things? Are they just making it up? I mean, after all three of them in their own way are diametrically opposed, or triametrically opposed. All three of them have different understandings of the entire situation. It's just busy work for Jewish scholars over the centuries and an opportunity to publish more books? Well, no. You see, there are rules to commentary. That is to say, not all commentaries are created equal, and there's a reason why some have stuck around for a few thousand years and others don't usually last more than just the off-the-cuff comment that a person might make. One, the comment has to actually do something to answer a question in the text. All three of these comments, in their own way, answer the question of why did this happen when the text itself does not say it explicitly. All three of them are trying to answer a question here. And that is rule number one. A commentary has to actually be addressing something that you have a question about from the text. Or at least you should have a question about it if you had thought about it in the way that the commentary wants you to think about it. Rule number two, the commentary has to actually be faithful to the text. Now, faithful is a very broad stretch. Faithful simply means it cannot contradict the events of the text. It can't say they didn't die and went on to live a happy life and play a vital role in the rest of the Jewish community. That we know didn't happen. We can't say that they didn't bring anything of question before the altar. That is an established fact. It has to be faithful to what actually is in the text. And rule 3, which is really related to rule 2, the commentary has to also be faithful and true to every other part of Torah. And that's the part that many people miss. You see, we are incredibly creative, both as a nation as well as a species. And we are able to rationalize almost any imaginary explanation for the behavior of others that we care to entertain. But the question really comes down to, are we being true to the events as they transpire? Are we being faithful to what is happening and why it might need an explanation? But most importantly, are we taking into consideration everything else? Are we looking at the rest of the setting? Each of these commentaries passes that test. An explanation that says that they died because they were too passionate, well, that is in keeping with other aspects of Torah and Tanakh, where you can have someone like Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi, to be removed from the world in a rather spectacular, fiery way, and that was certainly not as a punishment for violating the temple procedures. On the other hand, Do we have examples of drums causing problems? Well, yes, actually there are a lot more examples of that and of other types of fools causing problems. Do we have examples of what happens with arrogance and what happens when people try to lead from a position of hoping to lord it over others? Indeed, the Tanakh is almost entirely filled with those sorts of examples. All three of these different commentaries work because they are all teaching us something that is verified as true elsewhere within the Tanakh. Places that are very explicit in these same types of lessons. And thus, choosing to describe Nadav and Avihu's situation as being yet another example of teaching what is clearly a Tanakh-appropriate message is fine. As we don't have to worry of are we precisely right or wrong in interpreting the behavior of Nadav and Avihu, as long as we are within the ballpark of Tanakh, of Torah, of what God's values have been, then we're okay. Where we see too many people fail is deciding already what it is that they want to say, and it may or may not actually be justified, validated, or otherwise established clearly within Torah values, especially when those people wish to bend the text of the Bible to make their own points. They will often very selectively, very carefully, almost as delicate as a surgeon, remove certain passages from any context they are in, violating, of course, rule number 1. They will almost certainly lift it from any additional notes about that situation, violating rule number 2, and they will carefully isolate it from any other counter-evidence found, often in greater abundance, throughout the rest of Tanakh, in order to then hold up their poor, mutilated verse and the commentary that stands behind it as proof that God agrees with their position. In Judaism, we peer review. You don't get very far in Jewish circles making commentaries such as that. People will call you out and say, whoa, hold on. If that's true, then what about this psalm? What about this proverb? What about Deuteronomy? What about the rest of Torah? You can't make that claim. That doesn't make any sense. And as such, Judaism has continued to try and weed out that abuse of the text. Yes, we recognize that there is a huge range, a wide spectrum of opportunity for creative interpretation of so much of Torah and Tanakh. But it is still bounded by the basic fundamental principles that God has laid out again and again and again throughout all of the texts. Principles of tzedek, of justice, of chesed, of kindness, of ahava, of love, kavod habriyut, of honoring the dignity of all creatures and all people. Those are not optional. And any interpretation that violates any of those principles is clearly incorrect from the outset, no matter how convincing, no matter how eloquent, no matter how loud it may be argued. Yes? Well, it doesn't address the mechanics of it, if you will, of the cause and effect, in the sense of, was there something in the chemical composition of the fire? And that is because our rabbis were not looking at this as being a fire safety lesson. It wasn't that they had added gunpowder accidentally to the incense and that caused a fire to consume them, but instead looking for a spiritual, ethical, and moral lesson for what might have been. And the unique components of what they offered was less important than the motivation for bringing something that would be classified as an unknown compound in the first place.
Right, and I actually assumed that the foreign fire was a metaphor for something else.
Well, it could be. Indeed, the idea of the Eish Zara, that it was an alien fire, one that had not been requested, in the third commentary is used as being proof that this was a more generous gift, that they were adding from their own volition to what God had requested, showing their devotion and their passion. Zara there no longer being a pejorative, as being foreign or somehow inappropriate in this place, but as simply being not of the original request. But the individual components of what it was they brought do not seem to be the fixation of the majority of our commentary. Probably because there's very little insight for the rest of us of what we would learn from knowing how many parts myrrh and how many parts frankincense they put together for their own mixture of incense. Any other questions or commentaries? We are all allowed, and we all get to debate and discuss. Well, yes?
I'm just curious if you had a particular discussion or argument or something in mind that when I'm just looking for an example like that.
An example, well, unfortunately, examples abound all about us. We live in an age saturated with God talk by people that behave in ungodly ways. And as the caretakers of the Torah and the Tanakh, which are often used by people in ways that we should be not only cautious but ashamed of, we have to be careful to understand what are the limits of how far can this be stretched. We have a very rich tradition of commentary and midrash, and some people seem to believe that that means every possible interpretation is perfectly fine. And indeed, we welcome all interpretations, but recognize some of them will not pass muster. Some of them are going to fall down. And we should not be overly hesitant of challenging interpretations that we see to be fundamentally flawed and at odds with the rest of Torah and the rest of Tanakh. Too often we are too gracious in allowing others to speak on behalf of our holy texts in ways that are decidedly unholy.
Kind of like peer-reviewed science versus just like I can experiment in the backyard.
Very much, and just like in the early heady days of snake oil salesmen and patent medicine, before things were tested, any old poison could be sold, and many people would try to get rich off of anything they thought could convince someone to give them money for the cure of what they thought was ailing them. And unfortunately, many people suffered during those periods, and many continue to suffer from being offered spoonfuls of biblical wisdom that are not part of our wisdom. Shabbat Shalom.